Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Australia Wind Energy Forum. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners on this land that we're meeting today, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to the First Nation persons here today with us. My name is Charlie, and as a friend of Leader Associates, I would like to congratulate them on what they have achieved today. Leader Associates is an international event organizer in the field of clean energy, based in Shanghai, China. To say that the making of this event was difficult would have been an understatement. The team at Leader Associate never gave up on delivering this event, overcoming many challenges and obstacles and ambiguities. This includes complying with all states' rules and regulations around COVID prevention and adopting the official recommendations to ensure that this event is COVID safe. Now, mask wearing is not mandatory indoors as we've been informed. However, please feel free to do so if you wish. Event organizing has been challenging in this pandemic. And let's be honest, after 2 years of online events, I'm sure most of you will appreciate meeting each other in person now. But unfortunately, due to the recent updated pandemic travel restrictions between the states, again, a few of our guests couldn't make it in person. But some will join us over a video conference. For those of you who made it in person today, we thank you. The event wouldn't be possible without your support. Now, just a few housekeeping agendas. The event is being recorded and the keynote sessions will be available for ticket holders in due course. We also have a photographer roaming around, and if you do not wish to have your photograph taken, please let the photographer know. If you have any other questions regarding to the events, there are volunteers at the front registration desk that could help you, or any of us in the tags. Now, once again, on behalf of the Leader Associates, we welcome you this morning. We hope you enjoy the sessions that they've put together for you today. And if you're interested in tweeting, we've got a hashtag that we come up with, which is AuWE. Now, I would like to hand over to the chair of the plenary session today, Kadim Levy.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a good privilege to be here. It's actually interesting because the last event I was physically organizing was about 2 years ago, and it was about hydrogen. It is also interesting because the ratio of the screens is no longer the same as it is at home. So you'll apologize if I'll be looking at my phone because I did make a speech to make sure I don't forget, because at home, every event would have quite a few events. It's very easy to see what the points are, to the point where the memory is not what it used to be. So need to retrain that. And I think that's something that, we all as a sector are working on, just getting back to normal, meeting people and so on. So it's a good privilege to be here. I represent the AIE, the Australian Institute of Energy. I'm the chair of Victoria. I assume many of you know the organization, but it's a volunteer organization that's been around for more than 40 years. And I'll say a few more words about it a bit later. I'd also say it's a privilege to be here, first of all, because of the content. I think that, as we all know, the wind energy is a fundamental part of the energy transition. It's a long transition, a decarbonization journey. There are a lot of challenges along the way, a lot of unknowns, a lot of technology improvements that we're waiting for. So my hope is that today and tomorrow will help us with the next steps, just take another step towards knowing more, towards knowledge sharing and finding new ways of doing things. Also because of the timing. So as Charlie said, COVID, it was hard. It was far from trivial to organize the events, as you can appreciate. But it's also a testament to how we can overcome crisis, using determination, using working together, using technology. And I'd like to hope that this can be acknowledged as also inspiration for the journey for the wind sector and for the decarbonization in general. Also timing because of COP26. So COP26 closed a month ago, but as we all know, it's just a journey. It's just another milestone. And I think for us, this conference could be considered another milestone in that journey, this additional step that we can work towards doing things better and continuously improving. A few words on AIE. As I said, it's been around for 40 years. It's in its 30th celebration, we realized that we may think about a change that's going through now that's unique, but the people there that are now mostly retired, they said, well, 40 years ago, it was also changing, and we realized that it's a constant thing, and that's why we at the AIE, we constantly try and come to these events, help organize them, help knowledge sharing and networking, and we also acknowledge that leadership is important, and this is why we're very happy to work on this with Leaders Associates, because we see leaderships across different levels. This is not just about the high level management. This is about every one of us having the responsibility to try and do things better. On that part, we launched this year a leadership program, and we will continue it. It was very successful. We'll launch it next year. So if anybody is interested, more than happy to talk about leadership afterwards. I try to think, what can I say that hasn't been said already in terms of wind energy? I'm not an expert. I think most of the room, everyone here is probably a bit of an expert in the area. So I thought to mention that just general points that for me provide optimism that wind energy is just going to continue and expand, and this is the future. The fact that we have now state government support, of course, I think every state government has any renewable targets. It's the fact that even on the federal level, we now have legislation around the offshore electricity infrastructure bill that should support and facilitate more offshore wind projects. We have untapped potential for offshore wind. The global shift to net zero targets, as can be indicated by COP26. The increased interest of global players, like Enel, we heard yesterday about Enel getting a retail license. So I think there's more and more interest globally in the Australian market. The potential for coupling with other technologies, so batteries and hydrogen, and probably don't need to add much more on that. The aging coal fleet. So we know for the fact that there's no new coal power plants being built, so that generation needs to come from somewhere. And the constant technology improvement. So, all of us have seen graphs of the size of wind turbines, how they increase from generation to generation. So that's something that's quite amazing to see. In regards to the topics today. So today we'll have the state governments talk about their support for wind energy. We'll have industry leaders discussing the opportunities and challenges of the wind energy market. We will dive into the main challenges of the market. One of the main challenges, the transmission of electricity. We'll discuss the pros and cons of selling options, so spot markets versus PPAs. And we'll have a few more interesting keynote speakers on specific topics. The speakers come from all aspects of the sector, from government, engineering firms, developers, law firms, financiers, network companies, market participants, and NGOs. I think we may not have a lot of academics because there's a parallel conference happening in Erica. So, now that we can't be on more than one webinar at the same time, so we have to choose. So I think that's a few general points about today. So the Q&A format, we'll have a microphone up front. So if you have a question, we'll try and enable as many questions as possible. So would ask you to come front to the microphone. We'll try and give time for Q&A at every session, but because we are now physical, there's no Q&A, there's no chat, so we can't moderate. So what we ask is, if you have a question, please remember it to the end of the session. Try and be focused with the questions so that we can allow for as many questions as possible. And to jump into it, so our first speaker will be Lily D'Ambrosio. Yep. 5 minutes. So Lily is a few minutes late. So what I'll do is I'll present her. I'll present her. Oh, okay. Charlie's going to come in.
Yeah, so again, apologies. Lily's running a bit late. So I guess I'll just fill in the gap for now. Yeah, so, as we mentioned before, event organizing has been difficult, but we endeavor to do more of these in the coming year as well. So as a friend of Leader Associates, they've informed me that in the coming year, in 2022, there's going to be a few more events, a mixture of virtual events and also with a focus on hydrogen and wind and solar as well. So as the market grows, like some of these events will start to come back in person. Yeah, we encourage you to come along and visit the website. And just a few other agendas on the COVID side of things. So because we've been told that we can't have the lunch with tongs and plates and whatnot, we're instructed that to provide lunch in a served tray and a box. So a bit different to how you usually have it. But then do feel free to mingle though, because I think that's important since we probably haven't seen each other in person for quite some time. The other aspect is that we're constantly monitoring the COVID updates. And as you know, with Omicron, if there's any further updates, we'll announce it in the morning as we go, but we don't expect anything that's of urgency at the moment. The other aspects is, as Kadim mentioned, that the Q&A session will be at the front, but we'll also prepare some roaming mics for you. So there will be some help that we can provide. Yeah. So without further ado, I would like to welcome the Honourable Lily D'Ambrosio to the stage to do a keynote speech. Thank you.
Good morning to all of you, and thank you, Kedem, for your welcome. I made it just in time, and I hope you're all well. It is great to be here at the Australian Wind Energy Conference. It is a very exciting time to be interested in wind energy, and I'll be very pleased to be able to give you an insight into our state's ambitions when it comes to that very matter. But firstly, I'd like to formally acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we are situated. And my respects go to all elders of the past and the present, and those emerging, and any who may be here amongst us today. So given Victoria has the strongest wind resource in the country, and I don't think anyone can really seriously contend that, it is very fitting that the Australian Wind Energy Conference is being held here in Melbourne. As I stated last month, when we made the biggest offshore wind announcement in Australia's history with the Premier, Victoria has much to offer wind energy investors and developers. This includes strong government leadership and policy settings that is creating an environment of certainty for investors. We have rich resources, including a skilled workforce, established supply chains and commercially viable wind strength, and a proven track record of successful and supportive working partnerships with the wind industry. That creates an excellent foundation on which wind industry developers and investors can successfully build a thriving sector in this state. Over the last 7 years, Victoria has established itself as a leader nationally and globally in the development of clean energy. And this is due in large part to the depth and maturity of our renewable energy policy. Through our Climate Change Act of 2017, we have made it our goal to achieve net zero emissions in Victoria by 2050. And earlier this year, I announced our climate change strategy, which includes an interim target to halve emissions by 2030. And we've already well surpassed our first Victorian renewable energy target, which we set for ourselves for 2020 to deliver 25% of our electricity generation from renewable sources. We're now sitting somewhere between 30 and 33%. And we are certainly well on the way to achieving our second target, that is 40% by 2025. And we expect our third renewable energy target of 50% by 2030 to be more than met, but also creating more than 24,000 jobs between 2020 and 2030. We had a VRET auction, our Victorian Renewable Energy Target auction. Our first one supported 6 wind and solar farm projects that combined will deliver more than 900 megawatts of new renewable energy capacity. And our second auction is underway right now. But this leadership is not only delivering jobs and cheaper, cleaner energy for Victorians, it has made Victoria into Australia's leading jurisdiction on climate action. And it is sending a clear signal that Victoria's wind energy industry has great potential for developers and investors with the right skills, resources, and vision. Realising our policy ambitions requires dedicated investment, and Victoria leads the nation in renewable energy funding. We're investing a record $1.6 billion in our clean energy package. It covers a wide range of clean energy projects and opportunities, including our Renewable Energy Zone Development Plan, supported by $540 million, a fund that is specifically to catalyse the renewable energy zones. And this will unlock extra capacity in the transmission network for large-scale renewable energy across our state. We also have the Energy Innovation Initiative, $108 million of that to help commercialise innovative emerging renewable energy technologies such as wind. Victoria's position as a world-class wind energy destination is proven in the 30 fully commissioned onshore wind farms currently operating around our state. 10 more are in commissioning or under construction, and another 8 have been approved for development. Once all are operational, Victoria's onshore wind industry will have the capacity to power 2.5 million homes, almost all of the households in our state. And we've seen a strong supply chain develop to support these projects, be it Keppel Prince in Portland making towers, Wilson's Transformers in Glen Waverley, or Vestas in Geelong and Dandenong servicing our growing fleet of wind farms. Our projects are already delivering nation-leading community benefits. For example, the $560 million Dundonnell wind farm in Victoria's West was the first project in our first VRED auction to generate power. The inspiration for it came from a group of landowners keen to host a wind farm on their properties. This project saw the Clean Energy Council honour Tilt Renewables with its 2020 Community Engagement Award for its work and benefit sharing with local and regional communities, an important aspect of the industry in Victoria. While the contribution of onshore wind farms to our clean energy transition will continue to grow, there is also great potential for Victoria in offshore wind. Last month, the Premier and I announced the 3 successful developing offshore wind projects from round 1 of the Energy Innovation Fund. Our government is investing almost $38 million from the first round of the fund for the initial development and feasibility studies for these projects to kickstart Victoria's offshore wind sector. Together, these projects have the potential to deliver more than 5,500 jobs and $18 billion in investment, and provide more than 40% of Victoria's electricity generation. The 3 successful projects are the Star of the South offshore wind project for a proposed 2.2 gigawatt wind farm off the Gippsland coast. The second is Flotation Energy's Sea Dragon offshore wind farm for a proposed 1.5 gigawatt wind farm off the Gippsland coast also. And Macquarie Group's Great Southern offshore wind farm for a proposed 1 gigawatt wind farm off the Bass Coast. These private companies understand that Victoria is the place for renewable energy investment, and that does not happen by accident. This shows what happens when you have a strong ambition coupled with the right policy settings for global investors to choose Victoria as the location to invest, to create jobs and develop a new industry that will sustain us for generations to come. We will soon be releasing a discussion paper for our Victorian offshore wind strategy, which will look to assess the opportunities for offshore wind in the state and identify how the Victorian government can best support the development of a sustainable, thriving industry. Through this strategy, we will set strong foundations for transmission infrastructure, regulation, and investment to support the sector. We will also ensure any new developments meet community expectations and address environmental sensitivities. I am also very excited by the potential of this sector. It is a national sector for the country, but I know that Victoria very much is at the forefront of catalysing the first offshore wind projects in the country. I look forward to working hand in hand with many of you in this room to see offshore wind become a reality. For the Victorian government, making the transition to renewables is about more than megawatt targets. It's about possibilities and partnerships, possibilities for new jobs and strong local supply chains, possibilities to stop climate change and protect our environment, and partnerships with industry innovators and the community. Our role is to provide investment, opportunity and structure to enable the industry to do this very important work and to do it successfully and sustainably. With abundant wind resources to harness, sophisticated supply chain capabilities and strong economic credentials, Victoria has much to offer. We want to attract new technologies, applications, investment and experience that will diversify our energy markets and fully realise the potential of wind energy in Victoria. And together, we can drive generational change to a modern energy system with wind energy as its cornerstone. Thank you very much for the chance to say a few words. I hope you enjoy the conference and I look forward to many collaborative opportunities as we go to the next chapter of wind energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for the great overview of what Victoria is doing and will be doing in the coming years. From here, I'd like to move to our first keynote session, and this is about the state government support for the boom in wind energy. As the first keynote speaker, I'd like to invite Jesslyn Ireland. Jesslyn Ireland is a manager of the Energy Corporation of New South Wales, NGCO, one of the entities leading the delivery of electricity infrastructure roadmap. The roadmap is New South Wales government's plan to transform our electricity system into one that is cheap, clean, and reliable. Jesslyn's area of focus is supporting the commercialization of large-scale storage projects. She leads the delivery of the $50 million pumped hydro recoverable grants program, a key action in the roadmap, as well as the $75 million emergent energy program. She holds a Bachelor of Environmental Science and Certificate in Project Management. Jesslyn brings 10 years of experience in environmental regulation and sustainable energy markets. She's passionate about the transition to clean energy in support of New South Wales' ambition to cut emissions by 50% by the year 2030. Please welcome Jesslyn.
Not sure how to use this thing. Doesn't seem to be skipping. Okay. I think it's sorted. Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Jesslyn Ireland, and I'm a manager at the Energy Corporation of New South Wales, or otherwise known as EnergyCo, within the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. It's lovely to be here in person today and to see all of your faces in real life. And I look forward to chatting with many of you over the next day or so. Before I jump into telling you about some of the exciting work happening in the energy space within New South Wales Government, I would like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people today and many Aboriginal lands for those joining us virtually. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and we show our respects for elders past, present, emerging through thoughtful collaborative approaches to our work. So today I'll start by talking about the case for action and the transformation of the New South Wales energy system. I will then provide an overview of the current New South Wales policy settings, including the electricity infrastructure roadmap, the importance of social licence, and an overview of the key entities delivering the roadmap. I'll then conclude with an update on some of the key actions and initiatives we're delivering, including renewable energy zones, the CWO RES access scheme, and the design of the long-term energy service agreements. If there's any time, I'm happy to answer some questions at the end as well. So it's important to note that within the next 15 years, 4 coal-fired power stations in New South Wales are scheduled to close, starting with Liddell in 2023. These currently provide around 3/4 of the state's energy supply. Replacing these energy sources and building the infrastructure needed to connect them to our homes and businesses will take years. As highlighted in the graph on the right, it will take up to 10 years to develop a renewable energy zone to commissioning stage, and 8 years to develop a pumped hydro project. The status quo would encourage investors to wait for high price signals before committing to new projects. This risks leaving New South Wales consumers vulnerable to price spikes and electricity shortfalls. Action is being taken now to ensure New South Wales consumers have continued access to cheap, clean, and reliable electricity. Also on this slide, in the graph on the left, the light blue line represents the New South Wales electricity prices if we don't act. You'll notice a significant spike in the year 2034 and 35. The green line shows how we can stabilise electricity prices using the investment safeguard, which I'll provide a little bit more information about shortly, which is an integral part to the roadmap. Bringing online new capacity is not as simple as supporting generation investment. Network capacity, especially in areas of strong resources, is limited and risks holding back the scale of investment that's required. Currently, only 1 in 20 of the large-scale energy projects seeking to connect to our network can physically do this, because we're running out of capacity in the areas we need it. A chicken and egg problem stymies coordinated investment in both generation and transmission assets. Late last year, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the New South Wales government released the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, supported by its enabling legislation, the Electricity Infrastructure Investment Act. The roadmap includes actions that will work together to deliver whole of system benefits. It sets out a way to coordinate the delivery of at least 12 gigawatts of renewable energy generation and 2 gigawatts of long duration storage by 2030. The roadmap builds on the 2018 New South Wales Transmission Infrastructure Strategy, as well as the New South Wales Electricity Strategy, and includes the New South Wales Government commitment to develop renewable energy zones. They align closely with the AEMO's 2020 Integrated System Plan, which concluded that firmed renewables are the lowest cost replacement of this generation. It also identified that the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone as a priority actionable project, meaning AEMO has deemed it as critical to address cost, security, and reliability issues. The roadmap has several key actions, including the delivery of 5 renewable energy zones, scale efficient delivery of infrastructure coordinated by the Energy Corporation of New South Wales. It also includes a transmission development scheme, which includes RES access schemes and a new efficiency test to allow the transmission provider to recoup costs. The Electricity Infrastructure Investment Safeguard, which will provide incentives for the private sector to invest in the type and scale of infrastructure when and where it is needed. The Pumped Hydro Recoverable Grants Program, which looks to support a pipeline of up to 3 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage projects to support competition in the competitive process for long duration storage, long-term energy service agreements. Ultimately, this slide just looks to show that the roadmap sets out a pathway for bringing renewable energy zones online in time to deliver the energy to New South Wales homes and businesses as coal-fired power stations retire. The infrastructure safeguard reduces the cost of developing future electricity infrastructure by reducing the risk of projects and the returns investors require of them. Renewable energy zones and the investment safeguard will help us keep electricity prices low and therefore give local businesses and industries the competitive advantage that comes from having low cost energy. The roadmap is a decisive step towards thriving regions, a revitalised and re-industrialised economy, and better livelihoods for all New South Wales citizens. It is expected to save $130 a year in household bills and $430 for businesses, attract $32 billion of investment by 2030, as previously mentioned, bring 12 gigawatts of new generation online by 2030, and deliver on the government's net zero emissions ambitions, driving up to 90 million tonnes of reduced emissions by 2030. The roadmap will deliver benefits for our regional communities as well, by delivering thousands of jobs during construction and on an ongoing basis, through the 265 million in community enhancement funds available to host communities, and also through new income streams through lease payments for landholders hosting new infrastructure. The roadmap and the Act have been designed to provide the levers to make sure that we can deliver on our commitments to minimising impacts and maximising benefits for local communities hosting the renewable energy zones in New South Wales. This leads on to a very important concept that I'm sure you're all aware of, social licence. Social licence and benefit sharing is a core principle of the roadmap and the key underlying assumption required for the effectiveness of the national electricity market. Making sure the grid is built in places that work for regional and rural communities is a priority of the New South Wales government. The roadmap and the Electricity Infrastructure Act provide the levers to make sure this happens, and the RESs are delivered in ways that work for local communities. Some of these levers include Energy Co playing a key role in representing community interests and ensuring generation projects are incentivised to garner community support. Energy Co will also have the power to prohibit connection of generation projects where necessary to maintain social licence, such as where there is significant opposition from the local community. The access scheme will also play a key role. Under the Act, a component of access fees is to be used for community and employment purposes. New projects must not only compete for the cheapest electricity prices, they must also deliver the best outcomes for local communities through the competitive LTESA process. We're also developing guidelines on consultation and negotiation with Aboriginal communities for energy infrastructure delivered under the roadmap. There's also been a Renewable Energy Sector Board, which has recently been established to oversee the operation of the renewable energy sector and the manufacture and construction of infrastructure. And we're also developing a regional energy strategy, which looks to deliver on the ground tangible benefits to host communities and giving them direct access to cheap, reliable and clean electricity. Early and upfront investment in social licence has significant cost and time benefits to all New South Wales consumers. You can't understand the local concerns and values without talking to the people who live there and ground truthing your assumptions. Providing information and working with communities is key. Otherwise, misinformation will fill the gaps if communication isn't proactive. Losing social licence can delay, cancel, or add significant costs to projects that ultimately get passed on to consumers. Building social licence early can keep projects on track and within budget, and that has far-reaching benefits for consumers and the regional communities. Energy Co is already on the ground, running regional reference groups and deliberative forums and landowner workshops. These have been successful, ensuring stakeholder and community feedback is considered in RES design and delivery to date. So there have been some developments in this space over the last couple of months, so I thought it might be useful for today's audience to provide a high-level overview of some of the entities that are implementing and delivering the roadmap. On the left-hand side, we have Energy Co as the infrastructure planner, who will authorise and coordinate the infrastructure needed to support the delivery of the renewable energy zones. AEMO services have recently been appointed by the Minister as the Consumer Trustee. The Consumer Trustee must act in the long-term financial interests of New South Wales consumers and will play a pivotal role in planning the level of investment in generation, storage, firming, and network infrastructure over time in New South Wales. They'll also be responsible for authorising network infrastructure projects as recommended by the infrastructure planner. They will be running the tenders to identify the best generation, firming and storage projects to offer long-term energy service agreements. And they'll also be responsible for appointing a financial trustee to establish, own and administer a scheme financial vehicle. The actions of the consumer trustee will be subject to oversight by the regulator, who was recently appointed as the Australian Energy Regulator. I'll just skip through this slide quickly, but the energy, this was just to highlight that the Energy Corporation is a recently re-established corporation. It's a statutory authority established in line with the legislative functions under the Energy and Utilities Administration Act and the Electricity Infrastructure Investment Act 2020. So renewable energy zones are the modern day equivalent for traditional power stations. They combine energy generation like wind and solar, storage such as batteries, network infrastructure such as high voltage poles and wires to deliver energy to homes, businesses, and industries that need it. By connecting multiple energy generation and storage projects in the same location, RESs capitalize on economies of scale to minimize local impacts while delivering cheap, reliable, and clean electricity to New South Wales. Delivering RESs is a team effort. Private developers and investors will build generation and storage with support from the RES Access Scheme and long-term energy service agreements. Network operators will deliver the infrastructure identified by Energy Co as the infrastructure planner and the consumer trustee, with capital costs determined by the regulator under the transmission efficiency test. The New South Wales government has committed to declaring 5 renewable energy zones in the Central West Orana, Illawarra, New England, Southwest, and Hunter Central Coast regions. I'll talk more about the CWO RES and the New England RES in my next slides, but it's important to note here that the map also shows the indicative location of the Southwest RES, and closer to the East Coast, the map highlights the indicative Hunter Central Coast RES. A registration of interest was just announced by our minister last Friday, and the Illawarra RES, and the geographical areas for these RESs are yet to be mapped. The RES declaration is the first step in formalising the RES under the Act. The declaration sets out the network capacity, the geographical area, and infrastructure that will make up the RES. The Central West Orana RES will unlock at least 3 gigawatts of new network capacity, enabling a larger pipeline of new renewable energy generation within the RES. It is expected to attract over 5.2 billion of private investment in the region and support over 3,900 jobs, construction jobs, and 500 ongoing jobs. Energy Co consulted on the draft declaration in October this year, and the RES was formally declared by the Minister for Energy and Environment on the 5th of November. The government chose the Central West Orana region because the region benefits from relatively low transmission build costs due to its proximity to the existing backbone transmission network. It also has a strong mix of energy resources, and there is significant investor interest. Energy Co is working with the National Energy Operator, AEMO, and a range of network planners, including Transgrid, to ensure the transmission lines required to support the CWO RES are constructed fairly and appropriately to minimise impacts to local communities. Planning for the delivery of the other RESs is underway, and in October this year, the New England RES draft declaration was exhibited for feedback ahead of a final declaration to be announced soon. This slide looks to show the indicative timeline for the remaining RES declarations. A registration of interest was held in October and November for the Southwest RES, with a formal declaration planned for Q1 in 2022. The Hunter Central Coast RES is scheduled to be declared in Q2 of 2022, and the remaining Illawarra RES declaration scheduled for Q4 in 2022. To wrap up this morning, I was just going to provide a quick update on where we're at with the CWO RES access scheme and LTESA design process. So the RES access scheme provides a range of benefits to generators and investors by controlling how projects connect to renewable energy zones and the use of the shared RES network. It will provide generation and storage projects with increased investment certainty on congestion risks and grid connection for an access fee. The consumer trustee will run a competitive tender process to inform the allocation of these access rights. Energy Co is expected to act as the scheme administrator, supporting the ongoing implementation of these schemes. There was some public consultation carried out earlier this year in April, and further consultation on the scheme is imminent with the release of an access right product design paper specific to the CWO RES to be released early in 2022. We've also been exploring options to have a combined LTESA and access right competitive process. And this work's still going on in this space and a final position yet to be finalised. Long-term energy service agreements provide proponents with an option to contract to access minimum cash flows, reducing a project's financing costs and risk profile, and ultimately delivering value to New South Wales consumers. LTESs will be offered through a combined competitive tender process run by the Consumer Trustee. The Consumer Trustee, AEMO Services, is leading the project with Energy Co providing advice and support, with the first competitive LTESA tender scheduled for 2022. Public consultation was conducted on the LTESA design in August and on policy positions concerning Part 6 of the Electricity Infrastructure Act in September this year. Today, the Consumer Trustee, AEMO Services, has launched the first Infrastructure Investment Objectives Report, or the IIO report, and this includes the development pathway for the construction of electricity infrastructure in New South Wales to achieve the infrastructure investment objectives over the next 20 years. It includes a 10-year plan for conducting competitive tenders for long-term energy services agreements to give effect to the development pathway. Actually, later today, AEMO Services is hosting a webinar at 2 p.m. So for any, I think it might be recorded. So yeah, please visit their website to follow up on that one. And yeah, that's all I have today. But if you haven't already and would like to stay up to date with further developments, please subscribe to the RES mailing list by emailing res@planning.newsouthwales.gov.au. Thank you.
Yeah, so the good thing we have time for questions. So we have Charlie with a microphone. So we'll just lead by the classical if somebody raises their hand. Well, we have over there in the back. It's in the back, and then in the front is a second question.
I will put a caveat in here. I will aim to answer your questions, but I'm not the expert in a lot of these areas. So here we go.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding that RI for the Southwest Res.
Yes.
We know how hugely oversubscribed the first two were. Do you have any early indication on, how many people submitted that, considering it closed 2 or 3 weeks ago?
I don't have that information with me, but I do believe that information will be in the public sphere quite soon. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, Andrew Bray from Realliance. We've been involved with some of the department's work up in the Central West. I have a couple of questions. First is can you tell us much about the local energy plan? You mentioned regional energy something.
Yeah.
And the second one was around the ability to refuse a connection for projects that haven't got sufficient community support. I completely, applaud the sentiment behind that, but I'm interested to understand better how you gauge that level, because it's a very contested space, of course, and people, in fact, there's other projects outside that res that are already saying, well, in the res, there are the community people opposing a project saying, if this was in a res, it would be rejected because we don't support it. When it's a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah. So to your first question, it's called the Regional Energy Strategy. And this is kind of in its early days of development, but we are about to head out to the Central West and conduct some stakeholder engagement with some of the key stakeholders. But basically, the strategy is looking to deliver enhanced energy outcomes. It has a particular focus on the distribution network. So we'll be working with Essential Energy as the key network provider out there, and also looking to talk to, I guess, local community energy groups, local councils, local manufacturing. So looking to get an understanding of some of those, the desires and values that sit within that community in terms of what they're looking for, in terms of what these benefits should be, what the benefits are that we should be delivering on the ground. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that with the transmission network, the benefits come and hit the ground, but really we do need to focus quite closely on the distribution network and work with some of our key stakeholders in that space. So the regional energy strategy is looking to highlight what those initiatives are, and I guess the strategy in terms of delivering those. And we're looking to, I guess at the moment also, we're just looking to we're developing a framework which then can be applied across the rest of the reses as well. So there'll be one developed per res. In terms of the prohibition, the connection prohibition, so the details and how that would work are still being finalised. I am aware that there are some guidelines that are being developed internally on how this function would be exercised and used. And yeah, there's been a commitment to keep industry and the market informed on that. But I guess the first stop shop is just doing everything that we can to support social license before we have to utilize that type of tool.
Okay. I think there's one last question.
Hello, Catherine Way from DP Energy. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that it takes up to 10 years to develop a res to commissioning stage. And then you've got, I think on one of the first ones, 2024, that it's available for commissioning, I thought. So I'm just a bit hazy as in your timelines. Up to 10 years seems quite a long time. So I'm just wondering if you can expand on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess it requires, it's talking about the infrastructure that's required for delivery. So we have to make sure that we have the transmission there to support all the infrastructure projects, the generation and storage projects as well. So yeah, there's a series, I think there's about 5 years really to get that to a point where it then reaches financial close, and then you need to allow a certain number of years for the actual construction to take place. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacinth, again.
No worries.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move to our hybrid part. So our next speaker, Andrew Burnett, will be virtual, so online. So he will talk on behalf of the Queensland Government. Andrew Burnett is Executive Director of Renewables in the Department of Energy and Public Works, Queensland. Andrew is responsible for a range of renewable energy policies and programs supporting the Queensland Government 50% renewable energy target by 2030. Andrew has 15 years experience across a range of policy issues, including renewable energy, carbon pricing, and wholesale and retail electricity markets. Throughout 2016, Andrew led a team supporting the Queensland Government Renewable Energy Expert Panel as it investigated credible pathways to a 50% renewable energy target for Queensland. Andrew has also led work on key policy initiatives, including the Queensland Renewable Energy Zones and the Bomuba Pumped Hydro Project. Please welcome Andrew.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully I'm coming through loud and clear. Apologies for not being able to make it down in person, hopefully for next year's conference. But pleasure to join you here today to talk a bit about what's going on in wind energy in Queensland and some of the Queensland government initiatives to support wind energy. Overall, the Queensland Government support for renewable energy is one of the key drivers for the growth of wind energy in Queensland. There's three key high-level commitments that the Queensland Government has made. Primarily the 50% renewable energy target by 2030, or what we call QRET, and two targets for reducing emissions across the Queensland economy. a 30% emission reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, and a net zero emissions target by 2050. This overall policy platform has been a real boost for Queensland's renewable energy industry. Over the last 5 years, we've seen over $10 billion of investment in renewable energy, bringing online about 2,500 megawatts of capacity and a further 2,500 that's committed for construction. That's also brought around 7,000 jobs during the construction phase. So now I'd just like to focus in a bit more on wind energy in Queensland, which is really a growing story. As Queensland is the sunshine state, it's no surprise to anyone that solar energy has been a really strong part of our renewable energy industry. But as the industry is growing and we're seeking to diversify our system, wind energy is becoming a much more important part of the Queensland energy system. In 2015, we had one operational wind farm, a very small one, which I'll touch on in a second. But since then, we've seen around 700 megawatts of renewable energy projects coming online. The map that you'll see on your screen there shows the location of operational wind farms, as well as a number of wind farms that are committed for construction. As you can see on the screen there, we're now looking at almost more than doubling the capacity that's installed in projects that are committed, and a total of $5 billion of investment in those projects. I guess for Queensland, the wind energy resource has been probably a slow burn for most people. What we've seen is that rather than being really strong across the state, there's some really important pockets of wind energy, and you can sort of see those as the clustering of projects. Particularly in North Queensland, it's well recognised that we have some of the highest quality wind resources in the NEM in those areas. And so what we're seeking to do is develop those. I guess probably as counter to the development of solar energy, what we see with wind energy in Queensland is an anti-correlation between wind output and solar output. So it makes it quite complementary to the development of solar. And we're seeing more projects in the wind energy space extracting value from the market because of their ability to generate outside of that solar window and at peak demand times, particularly during the evening. And we expect that we will see more developers looking to access that real value from the diversity of the wind energy resource across the state. As I mentioned, Queensland's wind energy industry is growing. In 2015, we had, as I mentioned, we had one wind farm, the Windy Hill Wind Farm, which is 12 megawatts, which is obviously a very small one by today's standards. As we've seen the industry grow, we now have the Coopers Gap Wind Farm online in southwest Queensland, topping out at 453 megawatts, so a very large project. And as we move forward to the future, we see the McIntyre Wind Farm, or McIntyre Wind Farm Precinct, which compromises the McIntyre Wind Farm and also the Carrara Wind Farm, which is owned 100% by CleanCo. So we're starting to see the industry ramp up, both in the scale of projects, but also in its contribution to the Queensland's electricity generation mix. As you can see there, in 2018, we were very small on the chart. But we've grown almost at an exponential rate as these projects have come online. And already so far in 2021, with a month worth of the year left to go, we've already outstripped the 2020 data. And we expect that trend to continue as we see projects progressively come online over the next few years as they move through their construction phase, through commissioning and into operation. And so now Queensland's wind energy provides around 3% of our renewable energy target, of the 20% that we currently produce, but we expect that the balance of wind will significantly increase as we move towards the 20%, the 50% QREC by 2030. Just wanted to touch a bit on the regulatory environment in Queensland. So Queensland's planning and regulatory environment is governed by the State Development Assessment Provisions. So this is an overarching planning framework that governs all development in Queensland. For wind energy projects, this falls under a particular state code, which means that the Queensland Government is the development assessment authority for those projects. This is in contrast to solar energy projects, where predominantly local councils are the ones that are responsible for approving those projects for development. But in Queensland, the wind code, and state code, I think 23, for those playing at home, provides input and information to proponents about the types of things that they will need to consider as they develop their projects. This can include interactions with aerospace, so obviously with the heights of wind turbines and interactions with air traffic, telecommunications, and also things like property distance setbacks. So all of that information is set out, and it is provided to proponents about how they can understand the development pathway for their projects. As I mentioned, the state government is the responsible authority, and this is undertaken by the State Assessment and Referral Agency, or SARA. The SARA is the sort of the one-stop shop, I would say, for how wind projects are developed, and they will manage the interactions that projects will have through their life cycle of development with a range of different government agencies and regulations. So this might include understanding existing land uses, for example, mining or petroleum tenures. It may include environmental offsets. So if clearing of land is required for projects, that will be sort of captured through the SARA process. I think on environmental offsets, it's also important to note that while a lot of these things are governed by federal regulation, there are differences between the federal and the state regulation. So people should be aware of both aspects and how they interact with each other in determining the level of offsets that may be required if projects are to be clearing land for that purpose. I've got a picture there on your left-hand side, right-hand side, apologies, of a wind turbine blade being transported to the Cooper's Gap wind farm. As we mentioned on the previous slide, the size of projects is growing, which means that the components that we're dealing with are also growing. So quite obviously, the wind turbine towers are getting higher, wind turbine blades are getting longer. And this means, how we transport them is a much more interesting process for some projects. But there's also other components that need to be considered, such as transformers and potentially synchronous condensers. Very large, very heavy components, and we need to ensure that they can be transported safely to site. So there's probably two aspects of the transport that you should be aware of. One is the route planning. So as we've looked at on the map, projects are coming into all parts of the state, and we're usually seeing components coming into one of the many ports that dot up and down the Queensland coast. Getting them from port to site requires route planning, and there's probably a couple of aspects that people would need to be aware of. Because of the length of some of these components, the turning arrangements around bends and so forth need to be carefully managed, and potentially alterations to transport routes may be required. Similarly, with weights of components, we've seen that bridge infrastructure needs to be carefully considered, and whether those are correctly loaded for the types of equipment and the weight of equipment that is being transported. So early engagement with the Transport Department, usually done through the local offices, is critical to those route plans. If projects are successful in getting their project to the construction phase, moving components from port to site requires coordination with the heavy vehicle regulator, and potentially police escorts are required for those components to be moved because of the size and the mass that we're dealing with. So those interactions with Transport and Main Roads Department are critical to the delivery of these projects. As I mentioned, we're looking at things that are oversized, which may be the width of vehicles, length of vehicles, but also over mass, which is the weight of those vehicles. And there's specific requirements that are there for those different types of loads. But certainly the Transport Department is well aware of these things and seeks to get in early in terms of the planning phase, and are really helping to support the industry growth. So moving on now to some specific Queensland government initiatives. As I mentioned, there's some overarching policy measures that we have in place, but there's some really specific policy initiatives that we're now seeing really helping to drive the growth of the wind energy industry in Queensland. The first of these is the Queensland Renewable Energy Zones. So in 2020, it was determined by the Queensland government that we would identify 3 large Queensland renewable energy zones: the Northern, Central and Southern QRES. Now, these QRES are designed to ensure not only that we can harness the renewable energy resources that we have in the state, but also bring them to where they're required in terms of electricity demand. So it's a way of coordinating infrastructure, of transmission network, distribution network, but also bringing generators and demands together. So that's a really key part of the development of QRES. Now, while these are very large zones, the way they're made up is by bringing together the renewable energy zones that are identified in the Australian Energy Market Operators Integrated System Plan. So they bring together a number of RESs within the large QRES. But I guess that's important for a state like Queensland, which has such a large geographical area, about how we move our resources around in an efficient manner. And so by identifying these large areas, we can then hone in on where those particular regions might be, where the particular infrastructure might be within those regions, and where the demands are within those regions. They also have very different economic conditions within them and different industries that are supported by them. So what we're trying to do, I guess, is match up what we have in terms of renewable energy resources with the economic activity in those regions. We've now moved into a more detailed designing of QRES. I'll touch on the detailed design in a minute, but looking at the primary objectives there, and number 4, and I see that was also touched on in the last presentation about local communities and local benefits. And we've undertaken some consultation this year, which hopefully some people have participated in, about understanding what those community benefits are. So beyond bringing projects that bring investment into there, what do the communities require, and what do the communities see as additional benefits that should come with that economic activity coming into the regions? We've also released just recently the technical discussion paper, which is moving into more detail about how these Queensland renewable energy zones are constructed and the arrangements about access and those kind of things that are obviously key to the development of the RESs. So initially, in the technical discussion paper, we've identified just over 3,300 megawatts of initial capacity that can be hosted within these regions, moving from the north at 500 megawatts to the central with 800 megawatts, and finally down into the southern QRES, which is where we've seen a lot of development with 2,000 megawatts of hosting capacity. So what we're trying to do now is look at how we can bring projects into those renewable energy zones. We've seen that we've already started to see the development of projects, and the first investment the Queensland government made out of its $145 million funding envelope for QRES was a $40 million investment in the Northern QRES. And that's brought on a foundational project, but also by bringing on that foundational project has allowed the network to be designed and built to bring on that 500 megawatts of capacity. So I think that's a really important part of the way that Queensland's renewable energy zones are being developed. We're starting to see projects on the ground, and I'll touch on that in our next slide. The technical discussion paper was released and is now open for consultation until mid-January. So I would encourage all those interested in the industry and developing their projects to go to the website to find the technical discussion paper and put in a submission to that process. And we'll be using those submissions and the input that we get through our consultations, which includes a webinar this morning, which is in about an hour's time, so possibly may need to be followed up on by those in the room. But we'll be using that consultation to move the concept forward and how we expand these renewable energy zones over time. When we look up on the screen there, that initial 3,300 megawatts is the initial hosting capacity that we can deliver within the system at this current point. But our expression of interest process that we ran last year identified almost 60,000 megawatts of potential projects. So we know there's more to come, but the focus now is on getting projects on the ground and getting the res development underway, and also learning about res development as we go through the process, so that we can refine that and continue to deliver the efficiencies that will benefit all consumers. As I mentioned, the first QRES project is the Cabarn Green Power Hub, 157 megawatt wind farm in North Queensland. So as I mentioned, this is a foundational project for the Northern QRES, and by bringing this project into the Northern QRES, we've been able to add some funding from government to ensure that not only are we building capacity for this project, but for additional projects to follow. And that's the kind of initial model that Queensland government is looking at in terms of its res development. So we're seeing projects on the ground now. The photo that you'll see up on the screen there is one of the footings for one of the turbines that will be constructed over the coming couple of years. So work's already happening on the ground on this project. That is from, I think, this last month. We had our media guys up there on site and taking some footage. And the artist's impression you'll see on the screen there is eventually where the project will be. But we really do see these kind of foundational projects as critical to unlocking the potential of our QRES. The next major initiative is the Renewable Energy and Hydrogen Jobs Fund. Initially started as a $500 million renewable energy fund, but expanded to a $2 billion fund focusing on renewable energy and hydrogen. Probably the key feature of this is it helps to support government's commitment to maintaining ownership in the sector and a majority ownership. Queensland has always owned and operated a vast majority of generation, owns all the network, continues to own all the network assets, and is leveraging this ownership to ensure that we can grow the clean energy future that we require, while also ensuring that private sector involvement is a key part of the system. So this project allows private sector proponents to partner with our Queensland GOCs to deliver their projects. So we're looking at some kind of ownership structure, and we're looking to innovate in that so that the government can continue to maintain its commitment, but also leverage the extremely high interest from the private sector in developing projects. So as I mentioned there's $2 billion that we're seeking to leverage, and importantly, what we're really focusing on is ensuring that the industry grows and we're able to deliver really important investments while also delivering secure and sustainable jobs for the sector. By driving this investment with Queensland GOCs, we can see the investment dollar go further. Queensland's GOCs have now had a strong track record of helping private sector proponents with more than 2,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity under commitment from PPAs that have been struck between the private sector and Queensland's GOCs. Also, we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, the first new publicly owned asset, which is the Carrara Wind Farm, which is a 102 megawatt part of the McIntyre Wind Precinct. And by bringing in 100 megawatts of ownership plus 400 megawatts of offtake through the Queensland's Renewables 400 project, so 500 megawatts in total, we've seen that wind farm develop out to over a gigawatt. And that's the kind of thing we're seeking to do through the Renewable Energy and Hydrogen Jobs Fund, is really leverage the government's ownership and the power of those GOCs to help private sector deliver their projects as well. As we move forward, we've just ticked over the first year into this new decade. We've got another 9 years before we deliver the 50% renewable energy target. And the underpinning of that will be Queensland's 10-year energy plan. So it's really a focus on how we make sure we can get to QRET and then starting to look beyond that as we start to deliver on our long-term net zero emissions target by 2050. Queensland's electricity sector contributes about 30% of Queensland's greenhouse gas emissions. So moving towards a net zero emissions world means moving towards close to, if not 100% renewable energy in Queensland. So we know the first stage of this is building on that in this decade and delivering on QRET and planning for the future beyond. Where Queensland's really looking to drive is how do we increase the local economic benefits that we're getting from this investment. We see Obviously, there's a range of componentry that comes in that's part of renewable energy projects, and we're seeking to maximise how much of that can be delivered by the Queensland economy. Similarly, looking at increasing Queensland's capacity to deliver these projects locally, not only within the state, but within the local areas. So within those QRES, how do we make sure we've got the capacity and capability to ensure we can deliver those projects through local employment and local businesses? And a real strong focus on employment. Obviously, the industry is a heavy employer during the construction phase, and with the construction pipeline over the next 10 years, we see that there'll be plenty of action in that space, but we're also interested in how we get more. So once these projects move into the operations and maintenance phase, how do we ensure that we're capturing that? How do we make sure that local businesses in the supply chain are developing up? And also importantly, as we start to grow Queensland's hydrogen industry, getting in on the ground floor on some of these activities and processes and industries to ensure that we're starting from the ground and we're building up our local capability in those spaces. So we'll see more on the Queensland Energy Plan next year, including some further industry and community consultation. So I would encourage everyone to keep an eye on the Queensland Energy Plan as it develops, including new initiatives that will be coming out of the plan. So that's the detail of the presentation today, and I'm happy to take some questions with the time that's left. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrew, very much. So I'd like to just being mindful of time, we may get back to you, Andrew, at the end of the next session after the next speaker. So we just have to move ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Andrew. And we'll move back to Victoria, where we'll have Vanya Kumar. Vanya is the Executive Director, Commercial Investment Attraction in the Energy Group at Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Vanya is an experienced executive with expertise in commercial transactions, infrastructure development, and project management. A lawyer by training, Vanya also brings strong commercial, negotiation, governance, stakeholder management, and policy experience to her role. She has worked across a range of industries, including energy and utilities, banking and finance, construction, oil and gas, and transport in Australia and overseas. Please welcome Vanya.
All right, good morning all. Thank you, Kadem, for that lovely introduction, and to the organisers of the Australian Wind Energy Conference for welcoming me. I'm an Executive Director in the Energy Group and I work for the Victorian Government. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also the elders of other communities who may be here with us today. For the Kulin Nation, Melbourne has always been an important meeting place for events of social, educational, sporting and cultural significance. It's great to be here and welcome to windy Melbourne. Excuse that pun. Earlier this morning, you heard from the Victorian Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Change as she talked about Victoria's advantages and policy settings for the wind energy sector. I might delve a little deeper into the work we are doing and why. As everyone here knows, the world is rapidly transitioning to renewable energy generation sources. Corporations, communities, and individuals, young and old, the world over, are calling for climate action and change. COP26, for whatever its shortcomings, certainly had the impact of focusing global attention on a range of material issues. Australia itself is part of this profound transformation from a centralised system of large fossil fuel generation towards small and large scale, widely dispersed wind and solar generation. And wind energy appears to be the poster child for the transition that we are seeing. Indeed, it seems the images of clean, white turbines proliferate everywhere we go. Sorry, I didn't realise I was going to do this too. Okay. While we may not be able to predict exactly what the future energy system looks like, what we do know is that the energy system is fundamentally changing. Driving this are some key forces, and I might go with the 4D characterization of this change. Decarbonisation, which is a driving force, decentralisation, including things like DER and solar, digitisation. Now, this is an economy-wide phenomena, but energy is a beneficiary, and democratisation, where people are taking charge of their energy future. I might also throw in there disruption, but we won't go there today. Over the next decade or two, we are going to see an accelerating pace of change. The market is going to form and reform, and we will go through social and economic change, not to mention behavioural changes, and new technologies will become the norm before maybe, just maybe, we reach a new energy market equilibrium. Globally, in 2020, wind energy saw an explosive growth in installations, which surpassed 90 gigawatts. There was a 53% growth compared to 2019, and this is despite the impacts of the COVID pandemic. This significant growth was led by China and the US, who between them installed nearly 75% of the new wind power capacity in 2020. And this brings the global wind capacity to about 740 gigawatts. While this is a great result, showing the strength and the resilience of the global wind sector, experts believe that to reach net zero, wind power deployment must surge to a minimum of 180 gigawatts on average per annum. Closer to home, some estimates suggest that there are nearly 78 gigawatts of renewable energy and storage projects in development in Australia. Of these, almost 26 gigawatts, or 26,000 megawatts, which is huge, are wind projects. The Australian Energy Regulator's 2021 State of the Energy Market report has highlighted key trends in Australia's electricity markets. In 2020, over 3.7 gigawatts of large-scale solar and wind generation capacity entered the NEM, largely in Victoria and New South Wales. This has driven record levels of wind and solar generation in 2020, accounting for over 19% of the total electricity generation in the NEM. Wind output exceeded gas generation for the first time. In the last quarter, 1 gigawatt of new wind battery and solar capacity has entered the market, mostly located in Victoria. This includes the NEM's largest wind farm, Stockyard Hill, and the Victorian Big Battery. Additionally, there was record high wind output and near record low coal output. In Victoria, the state's renewable energy targets have helped create an environment of certainty for projects and investors. Last year, Victoria achieved its 2020 target of 25% renewable energy generation. And in the first 3 months of this year, Victoria achieved nearly 30% renewable energy generation. At 30th of June 2021, there were 21 renewable energy projects under construction or undergoing commissioning in Victoria with a combined capacity of about 2.6 gigawatts. Over the next 2 decades, 16 gigawatts of thermal generation, or 61% of the current coal fleet in the NEM, is expected to retire. Over the same period, up to 50 gigawatts of new large-scale wind and solar capacity is forecast to come online, along with up to, this is amazing, 24 gigawatts of rooftop solar PV capacity. While not the topic of this conference, energy storage, I think they're doing this next door, energy storage is also expanding through grid scale and household batteries and pumped hydro generation plants. They complement wind and solar energy, which is why Victoria is accelerating the deployment of grid scale batteries. While still in their infancy, technologies including renewable hydrogen, electric vehicles will also impact both on electricity supply and demand. The Victorian government has released public plans for each of these subsectors supporting their emergence. Victoria is the windiest state in Australia with world-class wind resources, both onshore and offshore. As the Minister has already highlighted this morning, Victoria has enviable average wind speeds around the state and is positioned at the heart of Australia's national energy market. Victoria is also home to some of the best performing wind farms in Australia. On top of its legislated renewable energy targets, Victoria has strong policy settings, clear planning frameworks to provide the confidence to invest. Since 2016, the Victorian government itself has brought forward over 1 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity from wind technology alone. This has been achieved through 3 key government initiatives: the Renewable Certificate Purchasing Initiative, the Bulgana Green Power Hub, and the 2017 Victorian Renewable Energy Reverse Auction. The first, oh, this is not working. I thought I was pressing the buttons. All right, we're just going to leave that. I'll get that up shortly. The first VRET auction, we will need to get this to work because I've got a video. Oh, no, it's working now. Sorry. Okay. The first VRET auction was one of Victoria's key policies for the renewables sector. The first auction in 2017 targeted 650 megawatts, but delivered 6 projects totaling over 900 megawatts of new capacity. Together, these projects will avoid about 3.5 million tonnes of emissions each year, which is the equivalent of taking about 1 million cars off the road. In September 2018, the Victorian government announced the 6 successful proponents of our first VRET auction, being 3 wind farms and 3 solar farms. This was Australia's largest ever auction. The 3 wind farms are the Berrybank Wind Farm, the Dundonnell Wind Farm, and the Mortlake South Wind Farm. Industry skills and development criteria were included in the auction process to ensure that local jobs were created, as were community benefits. And this is one of the reasons that Victoria is now the leading state for renewable energy jobs, accounting for about 1/3 of all the jobs in the sector. And earlier this year, Victoria opened its second VRET auction, looking to procure at least 600 megawatts of new capacity. Separately, through the Renewable Certificate Purchasing Initiative, or RCPI as we call it, the Victorian government is purchasing renewable energy certificates directly from 2 Victorian wind farms, the Kiata Wind Farm and the Mount Gellibrand Wind Farm. The RCPI mechanism provided the revenue certainty developers needed to underwrite their projects and progress to construction. The renewable certificates are used to meet obligations under the federal renewable energy target associated with the government's own electricity usage. Okay. I'm also very pleased to be able to share with you the news for round 1 of the Energy Innovation Fund. Now there's a short video and I'm going to see if I can get the technology to work. No worries, this happens. We will upload it onto their website at some point. If we can get it to work, let me know. So there were 3 successful offshore wind projects for the round 1 of the EIF, the Energy Innovation Fund, which are expected to kickstart Victoria's offshore wind sector, with the potential to deliver more than 5,500 jobs and more than $18 billion in investment. So the three projects are the Star of the South project for a proposed 2.2 gigawatt wind farm off the Gippsland coast, Macquarie Group's Great Southern Offshore Wind Farm, 1.1 gigawatt off the Bass Coast, and Flotation Energy's Sea Dragon Offshore Wind Farm for a proposed 1.5 gigawatt project off the Gippsland coast. So, so what is the future of offshore wind in Victoria? We know offshore wind has experienced rapid growth globally over the last decade due to technology advances, declining costs, and onshore development constraints. To date, 2019 was the best year in history for the global offshore wind industry, with 6.24 gigawatts of new capacity added, and an additional 6.1 gigawatts of capacity was added in 2020. The global offshore wind market has grown on average by 24% each year since 2013 and is forecast to have in excess of 200 gigawatts installed by 2030. China has the largest offshore market as at the end of 2020, with Europe closely following. But other Asian nations and the US are also commencing their development. We expect offshore wind to play an important role, both in the global energy transition and in Victoria's energy transition and the pathway to net zero. The Victorian government is developing an offshore wind strategy to guide this emerging industry here. The strategy will assess how the state should support the development of an offshore wind industry in Victoria and identify the scale, timing, costs, benefits, transmission needs, procurement approach, and other related elements for this sector. There will be more on this in 2022. So, getting back to the work Victoria is doing on the ground. We acknowledge that connecting to the grid in parts of the state has been challenging. It's a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Also, the reduction in output from coal plants as renewables expand has meant the transmission network is more susceptible to erratic frequency shifts and voltage instability. To address these and other issues, Victoria has established VicGrid. VicGrid oversees the investment decisions related to the 540 million RES fund. The fund was set up for investment in electricity network infrastructure necessary to develop the Victorian RESs. Through VicGrid, the Victorian government is committed to combating the challenges around the connection to the grid. This is challenging but necessary work that sets up the backbone of our future energy system. Following stakeholder feedback on the RES development plan directions paper and further technical and cost benefit analysis, in August 2021, the Victorian government requested AMO to progress 6 stage 1 projects under 2 procurement streams. A call for expressions of interest and tender process is underway for services to strengthen the system across the Murray River, Western Victoria, and the Southwest RESs. Following this process, the government will make a final investment decision. A non-contestable request for proposal process with relevant incumbent network service providers is also running for 3 sets of minor network augmentation works across Murray River, Southwest and Central North RESs. By supporting these investments beyond what is possible through the regulatory investment processes, consumers can benefit from more lower cost renewable generation entering the market, as well as non-market benefits, such as local economic activity jobs. And there is much more. The government will be making further announcements regarding the RES and the development of the necessary frameworks soon. On a final note, 2021 has been another year of action and opportunity for Victoria's energy system and the renewable energy sector more broadly. Building upon the success of our first VRET auction, Victoria is about to close applications for VRET 2. We are looking forward to announcing the successful VRET 2 projects in 2022. The Energy Innovation Fund's Round 2 has also recently closed for evaluation, and we will announce the successful applications again in 2022. We have also launched the $2 billion Breakthrough Victoria Fund, which will drive investment in research, innovation, and commercialization to accelerate growth in key industry sectors, including advanced manufacturing, clean economy, and digital technologies. As Victoria continues to implement clean energy policies and push towards the 50% renewable target, wind energy will be an integral part of the rapidly expanding renewable energy industry. We welcome the opportunity to discuss your project or initiative with us, whether it is to better understand our beautiful state, to meet our vibrant industry players and leaders, or if you're looking to relocate your operations or businesses, please do get in touch. We look forward to working with you to further expand Victoria's wind energy sector. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanna. And I think we have time for one or two quick questions. Are we all just waiting for the coffee?
I think everybody's ready for coffee.
Okay, cool. So we'll close it there. Thank you again, Vanya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. So yeah, we'll head out to break now. We have half an hour until 11:05, and then we'll have a first panel, industry group leaders group about the pros and cons, the challenges of the wind sector. Thank you very much.
Yep. Yeah. Check.
Well, hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break, had some coffee, had a walk in the exhibition. If you didn't, then use your lunchtime or the afternoon break. Feel free to do that. I'd like to jump in with our first panel session of the day. This panel session will be the industry leaders gathering, opportunities and challenges in the Australian wind energy market. We've decided to take it less formal. As you see, no ties. So that was a decision that was made just before the break. So on that level, I'll ask Amy Keane to come forward. She'll be the moderator of the panel. And I'd like to pass on to Amy.
Thank you, Kadeem, and welcome everyone today. It's great to be here in real life and not on Zoom. I think we all kind of forgot to how it goes, but we're working it out. I forgot to print my notes, but I've written them by hand. So we're lucky enough to spend the next hour or so with three esteemed leaders in the wind industry, and we're going to have a conversation about some of the opportunities, what their perspective is on the wind industry, and some of the perhaps challenges that we're facing and what we can do to solve those things. But before I launch into questions, I always love coming to these events and reflecting on where we're up to. And I was actually listening to this morning, someone was talking about the need for 300%, 3000% renewables. And when I started work in the wind sector, we were so proud that we had a 4.8 megawatt wind farm in Crookwell, which was the first wind farm connected in Australia to the grid. And we drive past these 6 turbines that were 600 kilowatts each. And, you know, hearing then this morning the numbers that the Victorian Minister was talking about, and the New South Wales government, where we're talking about gigawatts and gigawatts, it's just extraordinary. And now the fact that we're at grid parity with wind, and it is the only source of renewables is the only source of energy. It's just a matter of when it replaces former technologies is just wonderful, and we should applaud ourselves and those that have worked for a long time, and those that are newer to the sector, we welcome you. At the time when the Crookwell was built, there was a lot of debate about should we or shouldn't we have a 2% renewables target for Australia, and it kind of dropped to 0.5% because of funny calculations, and that was very, very controversial at the time for those that remember the MRET. And now, you know, we're talking about 60% renewables on a daily basis. You know, that growth is extraordinary, and I think what we'll hear today is that is only accelerating. It is not decelerating. It's going to get faster and faster, and I think personally, I think coal will come out a lot quicker than we expect, and therefore the challenges to the industry, how can they step up quickly? And yes, there are some challenges, but there always has been. We're dealing with very complex issues, but we've got a great team to discuss it today. So enough from me. I'm now going to introduce, on my far left, we have Jason Willoughby, who's the CEO of CWP. I'm not going to go through bios. Everyone's got their phones. Look on LinkedIn. They have extraordinary experience between them. I won't add up the years, but they're significant. No worries. And just to challenge us all, we have Steve N. Nethery. So Stephen Nethery in the middle. Stephen is the head of project delivery at WindLab. And on my left, we have Stephen Oswald. So excuse me if I refer to surnames, or certainly Stephen or Steve. And Stephen Oswald is the General Manager of Commercial Operations at GE. So thank you, gentlemen. I'm now going to straight away ask you, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? What does it feel like to be out, and what are you thinking about the wind industry? Maybe starting with Stephen.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, hugely optimistic. And, you know, I'm a bit of a power generation tragic. I'm a mechanical engineer by training and started out in power generation about 25 years ago. And my career has really followed that trajectory of transitioning out of fossil fuel generation into renewables. And probably up until 15 or so years ago, you know, we always thought that renewables was something that we'd do to fill in the time. Maybe it was a bit of a sideline, a bit of a cottage industry, and we've had ups and downs since then with the renewable energy target particularly coming in and out, and a lot of policy missteps. But today, renewables is the only game in town when it comes to power generation. And whether that's wind, and I think wind is going to play a huge part in the energy transition, or whether it's solar or other technologies. It's hugely exciting to be in this sector.
Thanks. And over to you, Stephen.
Thanks. And apologies for having a name that's just going to cause confusion all day. How am I feeling? Feeling good. Feeling weird to be in a room with so many people. And so if I'm socially awkward today, I'm going to blame that on everybody else, not on any inherent flaw of mine. Look, the wind industry is looking really bright. And one of the things that I think we're going to be talking about today is how to make it consistently bright. You know, how do we take all that opportunity and consistently unlock it, instead of having a bit of a stop-start industry that we have been experiencing, and you know, looking forward to finding ways to unlock that.
I agree. I share the same sentiment. You know, I think for a lot of years we had discussions and debates around should there be a transition to renewables, or if there will be a transition to renewables. And I think now it's just a given. It is happening. And then the questions for us now are how do we go about doing it? How do we executing this this transition? And I think certainly from even from COP, right, the key messages there of just the emphasis coming out of the finance community, and you know, just it gives it a sense of finality that yes, this is just moving forward, which is great because it removes a lot of the underlying uncertainty and allows us to focus on how do we do this the most efficiently and effectively.
Thanks, Jason. I think loud and clear that everyone's pretty optimistic, and the opportunities are huge. So I am going to jump to questions throughout the next hour. So please have them ready. Put up your hand if you've got a burning question. I'll jump straight to you. You don't want to hear from just me for an hour. So yeah, get them ready. So feeling optimistic, what are the opportunities that you see coming up, Stephen?
Yeah, and I would say broadly in the energy transition, in the near term, corporate PPAs and the leadership that companies are taking to decarbonise their operations. And GE in 2019 committed that by the end of 2020 we would be carbon neutral, and we partly do that through efficiency in our own operations, partly through offsets. But this is happening in pretty much every major corporation across the globe, and that's going to drive a lot of our business for the next 5 or so years. And then beyond that, meeting the emissions reduction targets that have been announced by governments and led largely by state governments. You know, green hydrogen, green manufacturing in later years. You know, these are the things that are going to fuel the growth in renewables.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, supporting what Steve said there, the obvious opportunity is coal closures. These coal plants are going to close, whether at a time of our choosing or not, and they aren't going to be replaced by new coal. So renewables are going to be how they're replaced. So that's the clear and obvious opportunity. There's probably 50 gigawatts of wind, maybe more with wind and solar, just in that opportunity alone. Beyond that, as you mentioned, hydrogen, Garno's green manufacturing, you know, obvious export opportunities. You know, this is going to be the next Australian export commodity, renewable energy. It's going to rival iron ore, coal, gas. It's going to be another one of those. So that's an enormous opportunity. And then electrification, both in Australia, replacing our oil and gas load with renewables, and how we do that. And then in our export partners, export countries, you know, replacing oil and gas over there is going to be an enormous opportunity. It really is large, and I expect I'll be doing it for the rest of my career.
Certainly in the short term, we're really seeing it being driven by corporate activities and corporate PPAs. If you have a look at the ASX 200, you know, in 2019, there were 19 companies that had sort of flagged that they had net zero emissions targets. That jumped up within 12 months to 43 companies. And I think that sort of step change is really indicative of the way that companies started changing their thinking about the need for it. We're certainly seeing it on a day-to-day basis. We just the other week announced a PPA with Nestle, which will be around our 11th PPA with an off-taker for our portfolio. And for our next project, which we're looking to, we've got a 400 megawatt project, we're looking to start construction next year. We're in PPA discussions with corporates, which would be enough to contract 2.5 times that output. And my sense is that if anything, we've only just starting to see the tip of that corporate activity. And I think a lot of the 2025 ESG net zero emissions targets are really going to be driving that. And if anything, I think there'll be, somewhat of a shortfall in projects being able to supply that. From a wind perspective, one of the things we've been really looking at is to say, how do we make the corporate PPA process a little bit easier for customers? It typically takes 12 months. It's a cumbersome project. You need your own advisor, and it's it's not very easy when your business is not energy. If your business is industrials or consumer, you don't want to be spending time and resources unnecessarily. So I think one of the things that will develop over time in the immediate future is how do we go about making that more convenient? How do we provide firmer PPAs than the current run of plants? And from a wind perspective, that's great, because the analysis that we've done around providing firm block PPAs suggests that the majority of that renewable energy is still going to come from wind. We're thinking somewhere between 65, 75%, depending on whether you've got a portfolio behind you. So the wind is going to be the backbone, I think, of the corporate PPA activity, and the corporate PPA activity is only going to be ramping up from now on.
Thanks, Jason. Can you just delve a bit deeper into that? We might touch on each of the points that the panelists have raised. What's the critical success factors for corporate PPAs to continue this growth for the wind sector? Obviously, you're saying that's critical. What really matters?
So one of the things we're finding is that folks have set dates and targets, and 2025 comes up, and as most of you know in this room, you can have all the best intentions of the world, but if you're starting to build a large a wind farm in 2022, 2023, you're going to be struggling to get it done by 2025. So timing starts to become a real issue for folks who've made commitments around net zero emissions in 25. And one of the things we're finding is that the scale becomes important, because if you have a portfolio of assets, you're then able to provide short-term immediate solutions to people. Now, corporates are putting all this effort into saying, I want to source renewables. Having to wait 2-3 years to be able to say that I'm doing that is a little bit challenging. One of the things that we've managed to be able to do is use the existing projects that we have to say, we'll supply you out of our existing projects, we'll build a new one, and then you can transfer across to the new one. Because folks do like to have that additionality of a new project. Everyone likes to say, I was responsible, I played an important role in contributing to a new wind farm being built. So that scale is important, and it helps us sort of better serve, I guess, our customers, which is really important at the end. And I think the other sort of observation we sort of make is that the environment, the operating environment, the regulatory environment that we're in is just becoming more challenging. Touch on a little bit later, but grid connection, but whole aspects of how we operate in this industry becomes more complex. So what does that mean? It means you need more resources, you need deep expertise, you need skill sets, systems, and that comes at a cost. And scale allows you to absorb that cost in a really efficient way without having to impact the cost at which we're selling our power to. So scale has lots of benefits. It helps you with your customers, but it helps you manage your business better in this environment.
And just following on though, Jason, is customers wanting the products to be firmed as well, and how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, absolutely, ideally, right. And so one of the things I think the industry will start figuring out better solutions to that. So one of the PPAs we have at the moment is a firm. It's small, so we're just sort of managing it within our existing portfolio. But we recognise that for us to do that going forward with a bigger portfolio, we need a few more tools in the toolbox, right? So we need access to some additional technology. We know that, like if I said, 65, 5% is coming from wind. We know that solar plays a role in that mix. We know that storage plays a role in that mix of different durations. So we've got to come up with a way of either being able to hedge firm that ourselves physically through assets, or we've got to be able to find a way of being able to do that with counterparties. And that's something that we're really focused on at the moment. So, we're sort of taking our responsibility and the onus is on us, right, to be able to better provide customers, make it easier for them. So there's some things that we're working on over the next little while to put ourselves in a position to do that.
Thanks, Jason. Please put your hands up. I'm trying to look. So if you just want to interject or make a comment, any stage, do so. Stephen, interesting talking about, I thought that was a great line saying that, I can't actually paraphrase it, but export's huge and it's a future and it's going to be bigger than we expect is what I heard. What's the critical success factors to realise that opportunity that you captured so beautifully?
Well, it's much of what Jason was saying. It's speed and it's predictability. It's an investment process, and everyone talks about investment certainty as being the key success factor. Again, you're talking to a PPA off-taker and you say, well, 3 years, maybe, is challenging. That's a really challenging discussion. Some of them are very experienced and they get it, but I think that investment certainty timeframe is a really big thing. My new shareholder comes from the mining industry and a lot of oil and gas, and they anytime you give them a time frame, their sort of knee-jerk reaction is to halve it and give it back to you. And that's also pretty challenging as well, because there's not a lot of reality in that goal setting. So critical success factors, approvals, getting them shorter, pre-connection processes, getting them definitely shorter, but also more predictable. And a range of other processes in there. Just more investment certainty is the key.
What role does government have in that, helping with that investment certainty and that speed and timeframes, Steve?
I mean, from my point of view, we think that's government's primary role. We're less interested in getting budget money because we've got parity, and more interested in them. I once heard of the analogy of, I'll drive the train, you just grease the rails and make sure the train's going to go along it. A lot of role in connection reform. A lot of the work that's being done around the reses, and we'll get to that, around investment certainty across the board, across a range of features, is probably where that's going to matter.
I think that goes a little bit back to what we were talking about before. Like, previously, we've seen sort of governments help facilitate demand for renewables, and we don't need that anymore. That role is now being filled by corporate activities, by others. It's a facilitation role that governments really can really make an impact on. It's the time taken to develop a project. It's different in each of the states with different durations, and that's not about sort of cutting corners and not doing the same thorough job, but can we shorten that down? Because with all this demand coming, how do we speed up the supply to match that? And then similarly on the transmission side, how can you facilitate a clearer, more certain connection process where people can make accurate assessments of how long this is going to take? Because at the moment it is a little bit of a, like Steve says, it's a little bit of a swag, right? You're sort of taking a bit of a guess. You're using the best estimates, and on the back of that, you're making commitments to third parties, which have financial and reputational consequences. So I think facilitation is a really good role for government to be focused on.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, in terms of just stopping and smelling the roses, that's such a wonderful situation that we're no longer in the space where government has to subsidise and call it what you want. That's been the space it's been in for a long time, or in the space of creating a market through demand, and it's simply just facilitation. Like, that's just, we just shouldn't stop to forget how exciting that is. Steve, you talked a little bit about electrification and the opportunities that presents. What are the critical success factors in achieving that?
As an OEM, the key issues that I think we need to address are, how do we scale our businesses to meet the demand? We are talking about demand that is many, many times larger than our businesses are currently sized to meet. So how do we do that effectively? I would also say renewable energy comes from a number of sources. Wind has some great advantages in terms of when wind blows and some of the other advantages it brings. Having said that, development timelines, construction outcomes have been less predictable than solar and perhaps other competing technologies. And so I think that's a big area for us to get better at as an industry on the OEM side.
Any critical success factors we've missed? Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Just want to know, I think Jason might have mentioned the grid. Yeah, and sort of process challenges. The grid strikes me as a system being built for last century's technology and the market rules perhaps as well. What do you guys see as the solution to grid going forward? Are the RESs the right solution? Are they going to be complete at capacity within a few years and we're going to be back to where we are now without enough capacity in the system? Keen to hear sort of the perspective of the guys that have got to actually connect to the grid and send those electrons around.
Do you know, I think, the situation we've got with the grid, right, it's sort of like we're trying to change the tyres and drive the car at the same time. So it's probably not surprising that we've had, delays and issues. And I think part of this is incumbent on all participants in the sector to do their piece, right? So from our perspective, the way we look at it, we say, well, we need to be geared up with the right expertise and understand it better because it's becoming more complex to connect. So we take some responsibility and we say, we have to play a role in making this a better outcome. I think the consultation that goes on with the industry is really helpful. And the fact that, we have the likes of AMO and Transgrid listen, I think is really important that they listen to some of the feedback coming because we've got this, everyone's going to be successful together or fail together when it comes to grid and connection. So that's important. I think the RESs, I think there's some real good positives around the RESs. I think one of the things that I don't think exclusively RESs is the answer. I think there's still capacity for projects outside of the RESs because we do want to balance that social license and the concentration of projects. So, there's no one, magic bullet, single answer. It's just going to be working together collaboratively to try and overcome problems as they're addressed. I think that's a bit of a catch-all, feel-good answer, but it's sort of the reality, I think.
Yeah, one of the things about when we talk about the grid is in your wind companies, grid is no longer just something done by that one guy over in the corner. We're a significant proportion of the grid. And so we're sort of, there's everything there. There's access, there's transmission build out, and then there's the rules and the processes around connection. I might focus in on that for a second. The Connection Reform Initiative has been a collaboration between AMO, NSPs and industry for the last, say, 18 months. There's a few participants in the room. I see CM over there being really contributing a lot of energy to that initiative. There's a Connection Reform Roadmap being released by AMO very soon, which will lay out the first steps in the plan of how we're going to change the way we do connections. And there's been a lot of really good ideas. We do have to think about making it easier. That is not an unacceptable thing to say. We do have to ask ourselves the question of whether or not we need to do that piece of analysis or can we leave it till later. One of the things that I've noticed though in that Connection Reform Initiative is there's not a universal view of what the problem is that we're actually fixing. And when that's the case, that's where you've got to start. There are legitimate needs on all sides of that, of what people need. AMO does need better modelling. Industry participants do need investment certainty. They do sign up to a range of contracts during construction that have LDs and have real difficulties for their company if they get stuck. we don't have a set of rules that can facilitate that at the moment, so changes are needed. So the connection roadmap will lay out a number of rule change initiatives to make that process smoother, but we shouldn't stop there. I would say for the market, any market body wanting to hit this transition well, the connections should be in their top 3. Making connections easier should be in their top 3 list of issues, if not the top 1.
Yeah, just a quick question. So yeah, Charlie from NG. So quick question, Nathan, Steve, sorry. You touched on the fact that there's grid reforms at the moment going on, whether it's with Red T or, upgrades and whatnot. Just wondering if you had any opinions on the private upgrades, such as the NECA, where the New England zone is proposing for, transgrid, and versus the traditional process, such as Red T, and also for this, the res zoning. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I don't know a lot about the NECA. Do you know about? I mean, in terms of the RIT-T versus the reses, I think the reses are, the RIT-T doesn't work. It's about stopping investment, not about fostering it. I think that's clear to everybody. I don't think it's a controversial statement. What we're getting from the reses is a focus on all of the issues associated with investing in new plant. We're getting access so that areas don't get built. So we're getting access reform. There's offtakes, there's connection, coordination, and then there's transmission build. And so it's taking a macro approach to what's needed here, and it's looking at it from the point of view of investors. The New South Wales scheme is probably first off the rank there, but they've all got their different approaches there. And I think that's what's needed is, to see what investors need in order to build their plant, and also, to see what the network needs and to sort of bring that together, coordinate generation and transmission investment, actual coordination of it. Yeah.
I will just comment. I think you're referring to the New England Connection Agreement. Is that the NECA? Just to clarify. So a unregulated transmission asset. And yeah, I guess there's 4 things we're talking about now. Really, there's got the government reses, you've got traditional contestable assets, you've got the unregulated, which Charlie just talked about, and then you've got even off-grid, which we might come to as well. So I guess there's a lot of moving parts, and it's very complex, and let's watch this space would probably be a reflection.
Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, grid connection, big challenge. Thanks, Mike, for that question too. Any other challenges? What tailwinds are coming? And how do we manage those? Starting with Jason.
So we talked a little bit about grid, right? So we won't go harp on that point, but I think one of the challenges for the industry is going to be social license. And it was touched on a little bit this morning, and it was great to hear about how much focus the New South Wales government has on social license. We think it's going to be really, really critical to the level of acceptance and partnership that's required with folks in the region who are going to be, hosting the infrastructure that we're all using to achieve our net zero emissions outcomes. And I think how we go about approaching that and making sure that the folks, it's not just the people who are going to be hosting the transmission lines and turbines and the panels. It's the neighbours in the kilometre radiuses. It's all the folks involved in that community to make sure that there's a sense of they're participating and they're sharing as partners and they're benefiting. Because I think if we get to a scenario where folks feel like they're not really, they're having to bear the impact, but they don't share the benefit, then I think that's where we potentially lose some support. And that is something that I think could really
have a pretty substantial impact on our ability to achieve the transition we're looking for. Yeah, New South Wales is a really good market for that. They sort of brought in those neighbour rules a fair while ago, I think, with our wind farms up there in the north. And you know, that's quite a leading situation in New South Wales. In other states, there are different models as well. I know WindLab was one of the first to bring in a community share ownership scheme, where we actually just gift shares in the wind farm to neighbours, and that's popular. It certainly helps, and it's that concept of they do have to bear some of the impact of that wind farm, and making sure that they get some of the benefits as well is a really fair way of doing it.
Yeah, nothing more to add, you know, outside the comments I've previously made around scale and just being able to connect, you know, this volume of new generation that's going to be required.
Thanks. Yeah, social license is a big one. I think there's a session on that with Andy Bray, who's here, and a few other people coming up. And we might come back to how we win the hearts and minds of Australians, because I think it's a really important topic. So I might just pause before we go deeper, because yeah, critical. We've talked a little bit about the future of the NEM, and obviously states are leading right now and doing some really innovative things. What does this mean for the NEM when it comes to wind? Maybe Stephen N.
Yeah, I mean, there is reform occurring. There is progress happening. If we look at the conversations that have already gone on today about the scale of what we need to build, that I didn't hear that 3,000% target, but you know, that's a big thing. The scale and the speed at which we need to do will mean that the NEM will have to be Ubered at some point, and that will mean that people will go off NEM. Off-grid, and off-grid is not just a remote mine site in WA or the Pilbara. I'm saying in New South Wales, in Queensland, in Victoria, people will go off-grid straight to hydrogen export. I'm already being told by investors that to do this, we're already getting customers in Japan saying the NEM is just a bit too much of a bureaucratic mess, and it's also not green enough. The need to go off grid is just going to be stronger and stronger and stronger. I personally quite like the NEM. I'd like it to catch up, but if we're talking about building 10 gigawatts a year, I just don't see how the RIT is going to cope with that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you just said, will the NEM be Ubered? But actually, just in the space of half an hour, we've talked about 4 new grid models that currently exist right now. So perhaps it's already been Ubered. Steve, did you want to make a comment?
And I think there's a whole swathe of new technologies that are going to enable this. So, you know, very cost competitive energy storage solutions, and you know, people just won't need to be connected to the grid, particularly if you're operating a resources kind of business or a green hydrogen business. Large resources projects, you'll be able to, you know, meet your own energy needs without connecting to the NEM, that's for sure.
Yeah, extraordinary times. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll keep going. Yep, great.
My question was in terms of, by 2050, most of the wind farms we start now will be the end of the life. So what's the future for that, to build new wind farms and replace the ones we have? What we're going to do with all those turbines in the end of the 20, 30 years lifespan for it?
Yeah, so maybe, yeah, thank you. On the safer ground here, for me anyway. So great question. And what we're seeing in markets like the US, which are, you know, got the jump on us in terms of installing wind projects, there's a huge market for repowering turbines midlife. And I'll talk about some other technologies that are coming in that will enable similar midlife upgrades as you go through. And so typically, the older the wind farm, the better wind resource. I think generally wind resource declines as you build out in volume. And so those areas will continue to be great places to exploit wind, the high value wind resources. And so, you know, I could see, maybe instead of having 600 kilowatt turbines, you might have a single, 6 megawatt turbine, but we'll be able to exploit and tap those resources much more efficiently in the future. But those areas will continue to be good for wind. In terms of managing, if your question goes to sustainability and the circular economy and those sorts of things, well, this is really a huge emerging issue for wind. Towers very easily recycled. Mechanical components very easily recycled. Fiberglass components and blades are probably the key component that there needs to be improvement on. And currently a lot of that type of equipment at the end of life goes into landfill. But we're starting to look at ways to convert blades in waste to energy projects, cement making, to try and incorporate those sorts of components into the circular economy and find some value for them at the end of life. And some of the pilot projects that we're involved with are showing some really good outcomes in terms of reducing the amount of energy that you use in cement making and those sorts of things.
Maybe just one thing I'd add on that. I don't think we need to necessarily just wait to end of life for the turbines as well. So our Bango project uses some of the GE turbines as a two-part blade, tip blade. And one of the reasons we thought that was really interesting was because you can then subsequently replace the blade tip, get some additional length, get some additional swept area, and it's all about creating some optionality into the existing infrastructure that you have. And so that's a really efficient way of then potentially increasing energy output and without having to do an entire sort of repowering or retrofit. And so some of the stuff that's being done sort of incrementally, I think is really interesting as well.
Yeah, great question. I think as leaders, it's really important to think about the next step, and obviously the circular economy and some of the innovation that's coming into it is key. So that brings me to winning the hearts and minds of Australians. And I think as an industry, we can focus on the technical challenges, and there's plenty, but there's always solutions if we've won the hearts and minds of everyday people. So we've talked about social license. One topic I wanted to ask you is about local manufacturing. The reason why I think that's so important is because of local jobs beyond construction during the long operation, because I think that is an elephant in the room with the industry. So what can the industry do to support local manufacturing?
I get asked this question all the time, whether I'm meeting departmental folks or whether it's just at the barbecues on the weekend. Everyone wants to know about manufacturing. People love manufacturing. The reality is that we do already have manufacturing in Australia in the wind industry. We've had 3 tower factories. There's a nacelle factory running. Our cables, our transformers get manufactured locally. When I built White Rock Wind Farm at Goldwind, we did a bit of a sweep through the project, and over 50% of the content was local. Now, a lot of that was balance of plant, but I think it counts. Excuse me. The biggest challenge for manufacturing in Australia is the stop-start nature of the industry. They're the ones that have to close a factory. You can ramp up and down a construction division, but because people can go and build something else. But think of Steve Garner down at Portland having to lay off 50 workers. Well, they're just going to go into Portland and not have a job. And then he can't just turn around and expect them to be there when the wind industry switches back on. So the best thing that we can do for manufacturing is to get the investment pipeline moving with certainty, get the investment pipeline moving with a degree of regularity. And then manufacturing comes from that. Those manufacturing jobs will occur. And if we have a massive market that we're talking about 10 gigawatts a year, it's going to be profitable to manufacture those items closer to home than over in Asia. And the reason that they have the manufacturing, apart from their cost advantages, is because they have large markets that those factories can operate within. It's the market first and then the manufacturing second.
Yeah. I think that's right, Sam. I mean, people say, well, it's very counterintuitive that we ship our iron ore to China and import it back as tower sections, largely, and we supplement some of that with local manufacturing, of course. But China's got the great advantage that they install 25 gigawatts of wind per annum, and so that establishes the local market for tower manufacturing and gives them that scale, and enables them to reach that efficiency. With scale and consistency and a pipeline that people can latch onto and long-term demand, people can make local manufacturing investments. I'll talk a little bit about a bit later on what's the next big thing in wind, but it's interesting to note that 3D printing, particularly of turbine components, tower sections, it's coming, and it is something that can be part of the local manufacturing scene in Australia, particularly as blades get much longer. You need to start making them in a couple of pieces. The opportunities around 3D printing of tips for specific sites and those sorts of things. I mean, that's all in pilot stage at the moment, but I think it will be reality in time. Also, there are just logistics constraints that you come up against when you're trying to get hub heights up over 150 meters. It just makes it impossible to design a tubular steel tower that you can actually drive over the Great Dividing Range. And that opens up opportunities for mobile manufacturing of segmented towers or concrete hybrid towers. I'll talk a bit about that. Some projects we did in Thailand that touch on that and use that technology for that reason a bit later. So there are lots of opportunities, but we just need the market here to enable people to make those investment decisions.
Do you want to comment, Jason?
No, the only thing I guess I'd add is, what Steve's talking about to me is really exciting, right? Because you're trying to, even the existing blade lengths, for our Mudgee project, we brought some blades through the Blue Mountains and through Mount Victoria. And, I don't want to necessarily have to do that again. So these sort of innovations are really important, right? Because it's sort of the size and the efficiency of the machines are important. We have to think a little bit differently about how we go procuring them. And certainly then we've got this large install base of wind, and then if we need replacement blades, being able to produce those locally is far more efficient than potentially waiting months for replacement blades to be shipped in from somewhere else. So that to me is a real upside of the scale that we're reaching.
Thanks. Yeah, and look, obviously there's a big role. I think the Victorian government's got to be commended on what they've done to support local manufacturing. It sounds like we need to promote more of the good news stories that are out there. I think All Threads is talking tomorrow about their caged baskets for wind towers that they're developing locally. So yeah, perhaps the story just needs to be said louder. And obviously regional jobs, we need to create those. We've got 10 minutes left, so we're going to start to conclude, but any questions from the audience?
So I see it as a constraint today, but I don't think that it's not a constraint that we can't deal with in time. Yeah, I think we've got, we build a lot of wind projects today. We just need more people who are skilled in it. And I think we're going to benefit so much from, having a consistent build out of wind. I look at my career at GE and, I think we've done pretty well in the local market. But we signed deals in 2011, 2013, 2015. It wasn't until 2017 that we actually strung a sequence of years together where we didn't go for a year without a project. And we're we're sort of in that zone now. It's only through that repetition, the learning of those lessons, which are largely in project execution, building those core teams around that pipeline of projects that you can make the investments to scale and develop the expertise in country. So I'm not concerned about our ability to get there because we're doing it today. It will require investments and training, and but that's what we do.
I think that's also one of the opportunities when we talk about sort of regional opportunities and regional jobs. So making sure that we have well qualified, trained local workforce is important. I think about the Central West Res, and that means that there's a really great opportunity to invest in it, and it's incumbent on companies like ours to help with that process, right? Let's take safety, for example. Having a really well qualified local safety workforce that then can go work locally on some of these projects is really important. One of the things I think we've really seen out of the COVID example is that relying on folks who are based in other states can put you in a bit of a tight spot in terms of having availability of people on sites. We've sort of experienced it a little bit over the last 12 months where we've had to lose some folks because they needed to go home. And so I think the answer to that is, what are we doing as an industry to start investing in the education and training of local workforces so that we do have folks who are well qualified to do those jobs and then go home?
And I think there was another question as well.
Andrew Bravery Alliance. I just want to return to the workforce, the local manufacturing question. Stephen mentioned one of the barriers, which is the stop-start part of it, but competitiveness of local products has been the other one. So I'd like to dig in a bit deeper on that. How will those really great things you were outlining before help to deal with that competitiveness side? Do you see that continuing to be an issue, or will it be sorted out?
No, I think, of course, locally produced products need to be competitive on a global scale, but it will be helped by issues such as logistics. So when first project I built, the length of the blade was 43 meters. Now we're talking 80 plus meters. Offshore wind 107 meters. You just can't transport those sorts of loads anywhere without manufacturing it in two pieces and assembling it at site. So, and then with the tips, this new technology around 3D printing, it'll be driven by logistics constraints, and then the amount of mass that you need to put into a blade in order to achieve the strength that you require to manage the load over a longer blade length. It needs new technologies. And so things like 3D printing enable you to make that leap, but it also helps you to manage what is sort of probably the largest controllable cost that we have locally, which is sea freight and getting these goods to site, which is a massive proportion of the cost of delivering a wind farm. So those two things together, I think, is where the trades can be made, and maybe the benefits can be delivered. And same with towers. You simply cannot transport 4.6 meters in diameter is probably around the limit, and tower lengths of 25, 30 meters is probably the limit, and but that just won't get you above 150 meters in hub height, and we're going to push well beyond that. And so you need to look at these different tower designs that enable you to achieve that height, that hub height for efficiency, but you need to manage the logistics constraints around that as well. And 3D printing of towers, it's in the experimental stage at the moment, but I think it holds huge promise. But it also, we've got a design partner, Max Vogel, in Germany, where we do these segmented concrete tower sections that are manufactured basically at the site in a mobile factory. And again, it helps you manage the logistics constraints that are going to exist in west of the the Great Dividing Range.
I think the other thing to think about with local manufacturing is that it just reduces some of the uncertainty, execution uncertainty. If you've got higher confidence in something being available, that makes a really big difference when we go back to, how do we service customers and give them certainty of when projects will be delivered. That certainly takes, if you can take a really elongated international supply chain out of that equation, that does reduce a lot of variables. So that's a really important factor as well.
Thanks. Any final question from the audience before I conclude? Yep.
It sounds like a huge opportunity. Yeah, I think we're in a tricky situation at the moment where global supply chains are really stretched, right? And so where you're trying to get components for older gearboxes or key components for current model gearboxes. The preference, like people are just stretched. I'm hoping that's weather rather than climate. You take my meaning. That is hopefully as a short-term issue that'll work its way through in the next 12 to 18 months.
Thanks, good comment there. Just before we finish up, some final comments from the panel. What's the next big thing in the wind industry and where do you see us in 2030?
Well, I think turbines will continue to get larger rotors, higher hub heights, larger generator nameplate. Wind farms are also getting larger, broad scale, and we spoke about some of the things that will fall out of the logistics constraints that emerge with very large blade lengths. Split blades, I think, are a good development. That technology will be perfected. I think will be an enduring part of the landscape. It's really important. 3D printing of components, blade tips particularly, to enable sort of midlife improvement of performance, site-specific designs. It opens up an enormous range of opportunities. And then we spoke about hybrid towers and that sort of technology to help us get to higher hub heights. As wind farms get larger, wake effects tend to also dominate. And so we're starting to trial the application of artificial intelligence to help turbines tune themselves during operation to reduce the losses due to wakes, and also some pretty neat trials around wake steering, where turbines are, instead of pointing directly at the turbine ahead of them, when they're in a downwind situation, sort of offsetting that, but in a calibrated and intelligent way to increase yield. And that can deliver real improvements in wind farm operation, 1 to 2% in some cases, with some of the broad acre farms that we're starting to see in Western Victoria. And that is worth real money, and it doesn't cost an enormous amount to implement. So those sorts of things are what we can expect, but also turbine manufacturers wanting to be sustainable in their supply chains, also being part of the circular economy, and ensuring that our operations are not creating any impact on the environment, and a net zero carbon operations as well. And that's a big part of the future of wind.
Thanks, Stephen Oswald. Stephen Nethery.
In terms of technology, I think that as well as bigger, better turbines will become much more a software game. And you mentioned your artificial intelligence. I'd support that. I think teams of in-house coders sitting in the dark, banging out code is going to be a really common thing. With agile project management techniques is going to be very common. Where are we going to be in 2030? I'm hoping that we're going to be building 10 gigawatts a year, and that Australia is going to be seen as the Saudi Arabia of green energy, which is just a terrible analogy, isn't it?
I certainly agree with those sentiments, Steve. I think the opportunity is really, really bright. It's a really bright future we have. I think what we'll start to see is, the technology will keep getting better. We'll start to be able to more seamlessly integrate storage with wind, for example. I think that's sort of something that is a little bit embryonic at the moment, but once we get that sort of figured out really well, that's going to help us with, going back to that firming story about how do we better to serve customers. I think that's going to be real helpful. But I broadly agree with the Steves on this point, right? I think we're going to see a lot more wind built over the rest of the decade, and I think we'll be better off for it.
Well, thanks, Steves. Thanks, Jason. Sounds like we've got a bright future. The grid's going to be Ubered, and renewable energy is going to be our biggest export. Thanks, everyone.
So thank you again for our panelists. Thank you. We're just going to break off for lunch. Just a bit of update and to recap this morning as well. The lunch session will be served on a box or tray that I haven't seen it yet, but it's all part of the fun of being in COVID or whatnot. So yeah, enjoy yourselves. Please come back at 2 p.m. if possible. And we have many other great installment for you in the afternoon. Thank you.
Results.